Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Sawal Jawab session. Today, we have Professor Ullas Kultur with us, who's a biologist at DBS TFR Mumbai and TFR Hyderabad. Professor Kultur's current research interests include exploring questions related to metabolism and investigating the link between metabolic inputs and molecular processes. Today, he will be talking to us about how our diet impacts our health and aging. Before we begin today's session, I would like to request all the attendees to please write your questions on the YouTube live chat. We look forward to an engaging discussion today. With this, I would like to request Professor Kultur to begin his talk.
Thanks, Arvind, for that introduction. And thanks, Anushila, for organizing this and giving me an opportunity to share some of the findings, but also explain the exciting science behind how food that probably most of us would take for granted shapes our physiologies and has such a profound impact on our health, and in fact, how long we survive and how well we survive. So I hope in the next 40 to 45 minutes, I'll try to convey the information on why food is such an important factor and how it regulates our genes and the way we, metabolize things, and therefore what the implications are both in terms of diseases and aging itself. Okay. So I guess ultimately, probably all of us will appreciate the fact that feeding and fasting is something that no organism can escape, irrespective of whether you're the tiniest microbe or the most complex organism like the human beings. Food, therefore, has a great impact on pretty much all cells and all living things that you can imagine that exist on Earth. Turns out that over decades of work, especially the ones that have come about in the last, let's say, 2 decades, have really thrown a lot of light or shed light on the impact of food on our well-being. And it's clearly known that depending on what kind of food you consume and how much you consume, it impacts our lifespan. High caloric diet, of course, probably most of us will be able to associate this with, sadly, because it's come to being that if you say that you're not diabetic or you're non-obese, people say, "Acha, aapko diabetes nahi hai." It's almost like saying that you're abnormal if you don't have any of these diseases. It's a sad state. So we know that food has therefore that have happened also is the fact that calorie restriction or consumption of low calorie diet also has an impact. And in fact, food seems to impact or regulate mechanisms, almost every mechanism that you can think about at the molecular level within a cell that has a causal association with aging. Now, during this talk, I will also talk about, is it all about just the calories, or is it also about our feeding and fasting? Many of you may also be familiar with some of these concepts called intermittent fasting, time-restricted fasting, where people have tried to project a number of hours that you should break between meals, number of meals that you should eat during the daytime, and all of that. But essentially, the reason why this becomes important is that again, like many of you will be familiar, increasingly as societies have modernized and particularly post-industrial revolution, the number of people who die because of non-communicable diseases has surpassed the number of people who die because of communicable diseases. Even during pandemics like the COVID that we are currently going through, heart attacks and metabolic disease seems to be a major killer, much more, several folds higher than COVID-related deaths. In fact, even cancer, if you see the second most risk factor, or the highest factor for cancer is actually excess body weight or obesity. This is second to cigarette smoking, which is interesting that obese people seem to have higher rates of coming down with cancer or have poor prognosis to treatment. Now, why is this so? Is it all genetic? Is there any impact on environment? Turns out it's an interplay of both our genetic susceptibilities and the environment. Environment seems to be emerging as one of the key drivers of why we uh, show as a population much higher preponderance or vulnerability to gain weights. Where is all this emerging from? Why is that we have suddenly become this? Turns out that this is something that has tickled and enthused people from centuries. And in fact, if you can think about from a mythological perspective, even gods and demons probably wanted to live forever. Now, Hippocrates, I guess, doesn't need any introduction, rightly pointed out that dieting which causes excessive loss of weight, as well as feeding up of an emaciated person, is best with difficulties. That means it's not just losing weight, it's not just about fasting, it's not just about reducing calories. It's about how do you manage your amount of calories that you eat, and how much you burn is what makes all the difference. In fact, even our own traditional medicinal systems clearly shows that our eating habits or our diet seems to be one of the major drivers of our health. And it's clearly recognized that obesity, for example, is an inability to metabolize fat. It's about body constitution. This is very important because that's what now modern medicine and modern research is pointing it out, which is how much of muscle and how much of fat we have in our bodies. And of course, inappropriate eating times and reduced sleep. Now, why is this happen? This happened because the way I put it is that we have self-domesticated ourselves. Of course, we have domesticated a lot of animals, and again, it's not surprising to know that you will rarely find an organism which is in the wild having to suffer with diabetes or obesity. However, animals which are kept in captivity, like the ones that are present, reared in zoos or at homes, domesticated dogs, for example, have a really high percentage of obesity and diabetes. So it looks like we have also ages ago we used to be in the wild, and we have domesticated ourselves. Now we can go back and solve this problem by asking our ancestors, but what is it that they did right, which we are doing wrong, to see if whether the problem or the solution lies in identifying what is that we are doing wrong. Now, this has led to a huge amount of research in understanding what type of food our diet impacts our physiologies, and which of these is better. Of course, there's a good amount of science involved, and a lot of rationale, and we know a lot about mechanisms about how food impacts our cells and our bodies. But this has also led to a lot of fad where people have, kind of projected all kinds of diets. These are just snapshots, and I'm sure many of us would be familiar. A Mediterranean diet, raw diet, nut-free diet, dairy-free diet, keto diet, paleo diet, you name them. It's true that all of these have benefits, but unfortunately, it's not just the type of food that seems to be impacting our health and our physiological fitness. Um, but we will deal with how a type of diet or type of nutrition might still have a bearing on our fitness in the second half of my talk. Now, the other thing to go back and ask is, if it's all about the kind of diet we are eating, can we ask our closest relatives in the evolution, which is chimpanzees or other primates, and ask, is there any strong preference to one or the other type of diet? Looks like that doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, you have chimpanzees and relatives who have mixed dietary habits. Some of them are predominantly frugivorous. That means they consume a lot of fruits. You have meat eaters. So if only meat eating or plant-based diet was the cause for this, then evolution would have already given us some answers. Looks like yes, it probably has some impact, but it's not just the kind of diet that we are eating. When I say the kind of diet, whether it is plant-based or animal-based. So this also becomes relevant because if although we can't go back in evolution in human history and ask, or in human history and ask what were pre-ancestral humans or ancestral humans were eating, one of the ways that we can probably make a correlative assessment is by um, actually querying for current tribes that are present in different parts of the world and ask what kind of diet they consume. Again, there is a huge heterogeneity, and there is no evidence to suggest that people who consume a lot more meat and fish versus the ones that consume a lot more seeds and nuts are any particularly better off than the others. So, which means, yes, indeed, seems to be that the diet has an impact, or the kind of the source probably matters, but it's not the biggest determinant of why excessive food or excessive calories is having so much of a detrimental impact on our health. And it's also not about the gender, because both men and women across the globe are bearing the ill effects of metabolic syndromes. It's true that certain populations seems to be more vulnerable than the others, but I guess if you now look at the obesity map of the world, I don't think any particular country or any particular race or gender seems to be particularly protected or resistant to gaining weight or becoming obese or coming down with cardiovascular diseases. So is it I showed you this. A rat or a mouse that eats a lot of high calorie diet seems to die faster. A rat or a mouse or a human being that seems to consume less food seems to survive longer, which means diet seems to have an impact. Is it all about calories or time? I did speak about it. Sorry, again, without a lot of slides. This is an important slide because if you think about cardiovascular diseases, of course, you can think about food having a major impact. But this is about cancer. This is the risk factors that have been actually found in the clinics, and you'll see that excessive body weight seems to be the second highest risk factor for cancer after tobacco or cigarette smoking, which again many of us would not be familiar with and might come as a surprise to many people. In fact, obese people have a higher incidence of cancer than non-obese people. It's not just genetics, it's not just environment, it's an interplay between genetics and the environment. I will explain to you as we go along. I'll skip this. This is a slide that I said maybe, probably we all domesticated ourselves. Domestic animals have a higher incidence of diseases, but not animals in the wild. You'll rarely find a lion or a cheetah or an elephant having diabetes in the wild. It's not about diets. Many of you have seen this. Again, I'll just skip through because I've spoken enough without the slides. It's not about also how we evolved, because in some sense, going back and asking our closest relatives, which are the primates and the chimpanzees, doesn't seem to give a lot of answers about whether it's plant-based diets or meat-based diets that have made us particularly more or less vulnerable to diseases. This is where I was. And in fact, one of the ways to best assess this is, again, of course, correlative, but you can make a fairly good judgment on this, is if you go back and look at the current tribes, because we can't go back in history, but nevertheless, using this information that we can get, if you look at the different tribes in different parts of the world, many tribes have meat-rich diets, and many others have plant-based or fruit-based diets or nut-based diets. Looks like these tribes are not particularly better. Some of these tribes are not particularly better off than the others. So, which means it's something to do with the calories and something to do with what we are doing wrong in terms of what we are eating, rather than the source of the calories themselves. Again, it doesn't seem to be because of a gender specificity, because men and women across the world are coming down with obesity and diabetes with equal risk factor. Of course, women seem to be slightly protected up until menopause for sure. The next thing that becomes important is that if it's not based on whether you eat meat-based diet or plant-based diet, Is it all about the number of meals that you eat? Is it the frequency of diet? A lot of people have done a lot of research on this as well. In fact, there's a lot of human studies also in mice and other organisms where people have tried to kind of restrict meals to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day, and you will find all kinds of information available. And depending on whom you ask, they tend to give you one answer or the other based on what their preferences are. But turns out that this is a fantastic article, which essentially the authors of this paper went back and looked at all of those trials in humans or studies in humans where number of meals have been changed, and asked whether there is any impact on the meal frequency on weight loss and body composition. They conclude that there doesn't seem to be a strong, significant impact on feeding frequencies on body composition or in terms of the risk factors that are associated for gaining weight. So, which means yes, it might seem to be beneficial to some certain populations, but not certain others. Within a population, some individuals can get benefited from one type of diet or one meal frequencies than the other. But overall, there doesn't seem to be a large impact. There is lack of a positive correlation between meal frequency and energy expenditure. This comes as a surprise to many people, which means as much as we thought we have understood the problem and found a solution, looks like it's still, we don't know where the problem is. But again, note that energy expenditure is the biggest term, because as long as you can burn your calories, you can do all the wrongs and possibly be still protected by an excess calorie consumption. Is it true? Yes, in some sense, this is true. The only thing that probably becomes relevant from our ancestral history is that most organisms in the wild never have unlimited access to food throughout the year. Even we, when we were in the prehistoric or ancestral ages, several thousands of years ago, we all went through what are called feast and famine cycles. So we went through time zones or seasons where we didn't have enough food and we had excess food, which means somehow availability of food, unlimited food, or excess calories, all of which seems to be having an impact. And therefore, this concept of calorie restriction came into being, because reduced calories throughout, now doesn't matter whether it is coming from one type of the food or the other, or how many times you eat, seems to be beneficial. In fact, a while ago, we actually showed, and we and others in the field actually showed, that diet seems to activate a particular gene called SIRT1. This is called a longevity gene or an anti-aging gene. And in the absence of this particular gene, even if you restrict your calories or diet, you won't have any beneficial effects on your health or lifespan. Now, that is well, but then why are we still behaving this? One would have thought that during evolution, you only select for best phenotypes. As we evolve, we should have better physiologies, and in fact, human evolution itself was all about gaining more functionalities. Looks like it's actually a cost of evolution or over-adaptation. It's the conspiracy of the evolution itself. While evolution was greatly enhanced or aided by our ability to extract calories, in fact, ability of the early humans to burn food was one of the biggest drivers of evolution and becoming humans, because we were able to extract more calories very rapidly and feed the brains, and therefore was useful. Seems to be that itself has become a bane for us. Now it's known that higher quality diet or higher nutrient-rich diets with smaller guts aided in larger brains, because you could process your food much faster. You could also provide a lot more energy to the brain, which also seems to be the case. In fact, even now, brain gets the first cut on everything that we eat. And in fact, liver seems to be feeding the brain no matter what, under all conditions, and the rest of the body can suffer, but not the brain. So this seems to be that almost it's an evolutionary conspiracy. what aided in our evolution seems to be coming back to bite us back, and probably we are paying the price for over evolution or over adaptation. Or could be that we are simply disregarding our evolution, which means what was an advantage to us, we took it for granted. But then we are all supposed to be intelligent humans. We are all supposed to have logic. We are all supposed to know what's right and wrong, and yet we all succumb to the temptations of high calorie diet. In fact, a lot of research is being done from a behavioral perspective, also about knowing about our taste preferences, our smells, a sense of availability of food, what kind of food we want to eat. And yet, you'll be surprised, we don't know exactly what is that cooking does to change the nutrient availability at a molecular level that makes us crave for cooked or processed food. We still don't seem to understand. It's not just the calories. It's something about processing of the food that has happened because of cooking, and probably the nature by which the food changes seems to have had a huge impact on our cravings for food. And in fact, this for people who are more interested from a scientific perspective, I really urge you to go back and read this nice editorial, which actually brings out all the evidences that is present in the literature and shows that somehow cooking seems to have altered the way our minds and bodies get addicted to processed diet. And not surprisingly, again, therefore, we know this for sure, that ultra processed food uh, definitely makes us gain a lot of weight. Um, and even if you have unlimited access to food, if you are eating an unprocessed diet, your overall intake is much lower than you have ultra processed food. Change in the body weight. If you have ultra unprocessed food over a period of time, you actually tend to lose weight, whereas if you have processed food, you tend to gain weight. Why is this the case? Again, is it simply the diet? Paleo diet, which is the diet that was largely consumed by our ancestors, was largely nutrient rich but energy less dense, in the sense it was having all the nutrition and calories, but our abilities to extract it was low because we didn't process it a lot. Western diet, typically the cafeteria diet, seems to have a lot of energy density and therefore seems to be a problem. Vegan diet, by definition, has probably one of the lowest energy density because you're not having a lot of calories in the vegan diets. It's not also just this. It's again the ability to extract the diet or the calories that our bodies are tuned to is what is actually playing the trick. So it's much more than just the animal or the plant foods. It's much more than the kind of nutrition that we are uh, eating. It's all about how our bodies are processing the nutrients. Why do two people who probably consume the same kind of diet, one probably shows a tendency to gain weight and not the other? So at the heart of the problem is actually how we process food. But that doesn't take away the fact that all of us, doesn't matter whether you are obese or not, always crave for unprocessed food. And this is again, at least in the US, it shows that independent of which society you're looking at, whether you're industrial, mixed, transitioning, emerging, or rural, our craving for um, processed food is higher. Why are we enslaved to processed food? Again, we are supposed to be intelligent human beings. Why are we still craving for this? Here again, evolution should probably aid us in understanding this. I'm sure all of us, whether you're scientists or not, have now thought about financial planning. This is all about planning finances. Let's just step aside and think about financial planning. Constantly, you will want to know what's your current worth, which means if in terms of food, you would like to know how much of food you've stored in your bodies in the form of largely fat, or in the form of glycogen, which is present in your liver largely. You want to know what are your goals, which means you want to know at what rate you're going to be spending your fuel, which is stored, much exercise you do, what is your daily routine. You also need to know how much more do you need because you want to keep it as a storage for future, because during evolution, remember, we evolved during feast famine cycles. So evolutionarily we were encoded to always store more, because we are always evolutionary kind of tricked to believe that there's going to be some time where we are not going to have any more food, and therefore how much of risk can I take. So the tendency is to always store more, because we always were having this feast and famine cycles, and therefore you start investing more and more. It's a simple logic which works in finance, but also works in the context of nutrition. We always seem to over-consume. We always seem to get into high-calorie diet because of this. Now, if that was the case, is it all encoded in the genes? To some extent, yes. In fact, this is again a study that compares a particular enzyme that breaks down, let's say, carbohydrates or starch, and in populations which have high starch diet, this particular gene seems to be present in higher copies, and in populations which have low starch diet, this particular gene is present in lower copies. We also find that the sequences of the genes themselves, or the regulatory sequences which makes them express or not, also are varied between less frequent feeders and more frequent feeders. There is less evolutionary conservation or more divergence in gene sequences in less frequent feeders than in high frequent feeders. Now, genes are also interesting because genes are essentially packets of information that is present in our bodies, and turns out that these genes can only be expressed when you can open up the DNA. The DNA itself is bound by several complicated machineries or complex proteins called histones. And again, people in the field will appreciate this. And whether you can express a gene or not, whether you can open a piece of DNA or not, is dependent on some of the tags that you add, or some of these post-it tags that you can attach to these proteins. What you will notice, again, even if you're an untrained eye, is that many of these modifications or these post-it tags seems to be coming from all the metabolism that's happening inside our cells. Looks like our diet is changing the way our genes are going to be expressed. Now, whether these compounds are coming from our dietary fibers, the kind of microbes that we harbor in our guts, whether it's coming from your exercise, your kind of diet, even your alcohol, turns out that all of these dietary molecules have major impact on the way genes can be expressed or shut down. In this context, genes that we work with have turned out to be one of the biggest or the most important determinants of how our bodies can interpret the nature and the complexity of diets, and how that can have an impact on gene expression regulation. So, is there a solution or a remedy? Remember, I started off with calories. The magic seems to be is all knowing about how much to burn and how much to store for the future, similar to what an investment banker will do, or all of us will do, trying to know how much to invest and how much to spend. This is a complex problem because ultimately the information is all communicated to the brain from all of our peripheral tissues. That means from the liver, from the muscle, from the adipose tissue, because each of those are giving information to the brain, which essentially computes all the information together and stores it as memory, not just the memory that we can think about, but also about memory in a cellular context, which has told the brain about what was the amount of food that was available during my childhood, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and what is the planning that should be done by the body for next decade or next year or next week. There's a complex interplay between crosstalk between all of these organ systems, and we've only recently just begun to understand how brain can have a top-down control on all of these peripheral tissues, and how peripheral tissues now talk back to the brain and help the brain to actually, again, compute all the information together and come up with a sensible response. But the brain itself is privileged because all the nutrition that is required for the brain, which is largely carbohydrate-rich diet, is provided by the liver no matter what, under what condition you are in. No matter whether you're fed, no matter you're starved, your liver keeps feeding the brain throughout. In extreme starvation, actually, the liver makes what are called ketone bodies and gives it to the brain. Remember, I started off by saying that it's all about feast and famine cycles. Now let's understand what happens when you feed and fast. But before I go in, I'll probably pause for a couple of minutes to see if there are any questions at this particular time, if someone needs any clarification. Okay, maybe I'll go ahead. So what is it about feeding and fasting that seems to be so important? Feeding and fasting happens throughout our life, every day, and we keep, having these hunger bouts, and we keep feeding. What happens inside our bodies? When you are starved, there are a lot of molecular changes that are happening inside the bodies. Stored energy reserves are spent. There is a particular hormone called glucagon that is secreted. This makes the liver produce glucose and feed it to the brain and the rest of the tissues. When you have glucose that comes in, which is largely just sugar, when you eat, insulin is made by the islets, and that now helps to shut off this starvation response, kicks in what is called a fed response, and insulin is like a key that opens the doors to the cells where all the glucose can enter into all of our cells, and cells take up glucose and utilize it for energies or for storage. In fact, in all living beings that have this system, glucagon and insulin have an antiphasic response. When glucagon is high, insulin is low, and when insulin is low, glucagon is high. Essentially, they play a ping pong kind of a game, and this ping pong ensures that our circulating glucose levels are present in a particular range. Neither is it too high, which happens when you're diabetic, neither is it too low, which happens in what is called when you become hypoglycemic. In fact, this is a lot more risky because we can die because of hypoglycemia. Now, this is known. But the problem is, what happens is a lot more complicated, because your diet is not only about sugar, it's not only about carbohydrate. Essentially, what happens when you're starved or fed is a lot more interaction between all of these tissues, which is the pancreas, the adipocytes, the muscle, and the liver. In a fed state, remember what I said, your glucose comes in, glucose stimulates your pancreas to release insulin. This insulin allows the cells to enter the adipocytes. These are your bankers. They store the glucose in the form of fat for future use, like your FDs or mutual funds. Muscle utilizes this. It also stores glucose in the form of glycogen to some extent, but also utilizes it as soon as the glucose comes in. Your liver plays as a master metabolic tissue, where it now should decide how much of this glucose should be made available to the brain and to the rest of the body, because the glucose first enters the liver and the islets. On the contrary, when you fast, or the opposite thing happens, there is another hormone called glucagon that's released that helps to release all your FDs. It's almost like you're going through, suppose if you have gone through a job loss, or you don't have a salary that is being given by your employer, you need to dip into your stored reserves. It's unclear at what rate you want to liquidate your funds. We still don't know how is the body computing this. That fats are actually made available to both the muscles and the liver. In fact, all of that fat first comes to the liver. Liver repackages it and sends it to all other tissues. Liver also makes glucose when you're starved. This glucose is again made available to the rest of the body, which means there is a toggling between fed and fast cycles. And what I would like you to appreciate is that the liver seems to take fat and many other components and has the ability to convert carbohydrate into lipid or fat, or fat into carbohydrate. You can take glucose and convert it into fat, and you can take fat and convert it to anything else. And therefore, it seems to be acting as one of those bookkeepers that shows where should the fund be invested. This is more like your investment advisor. Investment itself is happening in your fat depots, but the decision about how much to store and where to send seems to involve liver. Of course, brain has a role because brain has the history of what has happened during evolution and in your life history itself. So if that is important, what will happen if I don't have a normal feed fast cycle? Is it possible that your liver knows when is the next meal coming? What we have discovered is a set of mechanisms, genetic based mechanisms, that can anticipate a fed response. We found that there are certain small RNAs or small molecules called RNAs that are produced in a starvation state that can anticipate when you're going to be fed. And this is important because these molecules ensure that you go from a fasted to a refed state efficiently. In some sense, we have identified a molecular memory that is present within the hepatocytes or within the liver cells that allows the liver to go back and forth between fed and fast cycles, because you want to make sure that you toggle between the fed and fast cycles. This is important because, in fact, if you go back and again look at clinical literature, your inability to go between fed and fast cycles is often associated with liver diseases, even liver cancer, because it goes through what is called a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. In fact, this is supposed to be one of the major health problems in current day populations. In India, it's estimated as high as 60% of the population seems to have fatty livers. This is that we don't realize this because liver itself has a lot of buffer capacity. Liver seems to function until a lot of it is actually becomes bad. Therefore, we don't realize until a lot of liver is actually gone bad. Therefore, our inability to go back and forth between fed and fast cycles seems to be one of the major drivers of liver diseases and also of liver cancer. But this is important because, remember, I said liver is important because it can regulate the whole body energetics, because it provides all the other tissues with what it needs. What we found is that these small molecules that creates memory that allows these transitions to happen are actually changed in aging or in obese context. So for the first time, probably we have identified some of the unique molecular mechanisms that build a memory of feed and fast cycles, and these molecules that constitute memory seems to have been perturbed when you're old or when you're obese. Now, whether changing these causes obesity or aging is something that we are now trying to assess. Remember, I've been saying that it's all about calories and calories. Calorie restriction, therefore, has emerged as one of the biggest, clinically reproducible and an intervention that can be made, which helps gain health. Of course, you can pop a pill, but the best way to actually mitigate ill effects of bad diets seems to be calorie restriction. It's now known to impact all known organisms from a single cell yeast to humans and give benefits of better health and longer lifespans. Here again, it just shows that if you are on a calorie restricted diet, all your parameters, good physiological parameters, have improved and organisms seems to live longer. So in some sense, turns out that not just restricting your time of the day diet, how long you feed and fast, it's also about calories, about what kind of calories you're taking seems to be important. We have earlier shown, remember I did say that, we've also been one of the leading labs that identified the importance of this particular gene called SIRT1, which is a longevity gene. And we found that simply by improving the functionality of this gene, you can mimic the effects of calorie restriction. Or if you don't have this gene, the extensional lifespan that you see is lost because you don't have this gene function. This is important because, remember, what would you do if you already have become obese? What would you do if you're already in middle age or late age? Can I activate this gene? Can I pop a pill to activate this gene so that I can probably rescue myself? This is important. In fact, this is $1 million, several hundreds of $1 million industry where a lot of pharma companies are chasing this molecule and the ones related to this to find that magic bullet that will probably save us from obesity, diabetes, heart attacks, and aging. So, if indeed 31 is an anti aging gene, is it good to increase its expression of function uncontrollably? What we found, not really. In fact, here again, your fed and fast cycle becomes important. What we identified is that this gene is required to function in a starvation phase, but you don't want this to be functioning in a fed state. In a fed state, you want to make sure that this particular gene product is lost so that you can actually store fat, you can actually store the nutrients for future use. Is it true that therefore turning an angel into a devil can happen by simply overactivating it? Looks like it's the case. What we found is that if there is a particular regulatory mechanism, there is a particular switch in this protein. If you lose that switch, this protein or this gene product continues to remain in the fed state. Remember, it's supposed to go away in the fed state. If it continues to remain in the fed state, actually it causes insulin resistant diabetes and also causes liver damage, which is interesting, which brings back the concept that it's all about calories. It's all about your feed and fast cycles. It's neither only about calories, it's not only about feed and fast cycles. You need to watch your calories. You also need to make sure that you go through fed fast cycles. If you don't go through your fed fast cycles, you are probably going to be as harmed as having obese diet. The reason this is important is because our bodies, remember, have multiple sources of fuel to burn. It has fat that it can burn to provide energies. It has proteins that can burn to provide energies. It has carbohydrates that it has burned to provide energies. Carbohydrate or sugar is the preferred source of energy. Now, why is this important? Again, let's step aside from biology. Let's think about how cars work. Remember, some of the earlier cars were all steam engine based. Then came gasoline engine or diesel engines. We also improved our fuel quality. You also have petrol, which itself is something called, you have a speed petrol, you have a normal petrol, you have aviation petrol. You also have now hybrid cars and hydrogen fuel cars. Now, why is this all important? It's important because fuel selection and engine capacity seems to be the biggest determinants of burning efficiency and transmission efficiency, which means what fuel you use and what rate at what rate you burn determines how much you burn and how much efficiency you get from burning that particular fuel. So is there an engine equivalent in our living cells? Yes. Turns out mitochondria are the engine equivalents inside the cells. Here again, imagine if our bodies were cars. Imagine if you had multiple fuel tanks, each of them filled with different fuels. Your engine is utilizing one or the other fuel. A priori, there is no information on which fuel to be used. Your engine can, in principle, use one or the other fuel depending on the usage or the speed at which the car has to drive. Of course, that goes through a microchip, that goes through an information center, that goes through a computer, which one could equate as the brain. There is an interaction between the mitochondria in the brain and in all of the bodies with the neurons to make the decision about which fuel to be used. So in our case, you have three choices. Engine is my mitochondria. And then you can say, what is that I'm going to use? But even when you want to use it, Remember, again, cars and engines have both gears and clutches. You can use the energies without doing any work, which means you can simply turn on the engine, press on the accelerator, and you simply burn all your energies. Or you can engage it in gear and you make work happen, which means the extent to which you burn your stored diet also depends on what is it that you're doing with the energy itself. Is it possible that I can actually burn a lot of energy for nothing? Should I always engage my car and do some activity? Well, that's the trick. What if we could burn a lot of our stored energies without a lot of exercise? We could still be couch potatoes and thin, lean, and smart and fit. Is possible? Well, I wouldn't advise that, but definitely there is a mechanism that seems to control that. We seem to have gained a molecular handle on a particular pair of proteins, let's not go into the names, which seems to tell when to engage the clutch or when to release the clutch. So, in some sense, I can have an engine running at full speed, all my cylinders firing. If I engage the clutch, I can simply burn it off. Imagine if I'm burning fat, I can burn fat at no cost. I'll continue to remain slim. But if I engage the clutch, I don't utilize a lot of fat. I can, then, utilize it for more work. Is this the pair of proteins that can do this trick? Possibly one of the pairs, and we seem to have just stumbled upon this particular pair that seems to indicate or determine which fuel to burn and what rate you want to burn this fuel. Is it true? Turns out to be the case, because work from our lab and from our colleagues elsewhere in the world has shown that if you knock out this particular gene called 34, and if you feed these mice with high fat diet, which means normally mice would become obese and fat. If you don't have this gene, turns out these mice continue to be lean and happy and whatever. Which means that if I don't have this gene, you can simply burn all the excess calories that you eat, and you can be well off. Now, if knockout is giving you an advantage, then you can ask, why did evolution choose to retain this gene in all our bodies? Usually evolution is smart. It discards all the bad genes, possibly, but only retains good genes. Then why is this seemingly bad gene was kept? Because without it, we could all continue to be lean and happy. No, that's not the end of the story. The reason is, it's not just about what is happening at a size level. It's also about how we are utilizing your fat. For that, I'll just play a video. On the left side, you will see a mouse that has this gene. On the right side, you have a mouse that doesn't have this gene. Remember, this mice, when fed with high fat diet, this fellow never becomes obese. This fellow becomes obese. But then, is this fellow really healthy? You will see that this particular mouse cannot run, cannot keep up the pace, is physically weak, its muscles are weak. Whereas the mouse that actually has this gene seems to be faring better. Which means there is a cost to your energy efficiency. It's not just about becoming lean. There's a lot more complex computation that's happening in our bodies, which to some extent we have understood, but we have a long way to go in trying to crack the code about how calories and decisions made by different tissues impact other tissues, and collectively what happens as an organism. What seems to be a benefit seems to be a problem. On the one case, you don't become fat, but on the other hand, you become less active and your muscle seems to be weak. I'll stop here again before I just conclude. If there are any questions, I'll be able to take.
Hi, Ullas. So
Yeah.
there are some questions. One of the question is, so you spoke about SIRT1 expression,
Yes.
and you also spoke about how certain miRNAs are activated during the fed-fast cycle. Now, was it shown that these miRNAs directly regulate SIRT1 expression, or are there any other factors, like say, how is diet actually regulating SIRT1 expression at a molecular level?
So we know, to some extent, we know what molecular mechanisms regulate certain expression, but not all certwins. In fact, one of the things that we are doing is with 34. But let's go back to microRNAs because that really seems to be very exciting because it's an anticipatory mechanism, right? We think
Yes.
fasting responses, your low carbohydrates, your glucagon, reduced energy state of the cell is inducing expression of these regulatory microRNAs in a fasted state so that they can act in a fed state. Currently, we're trying to ask if it's only fed fast cycle or is also encoded by our sleep wake cycles, which means our circadian rhythms. Because circadian rhythm impacts our fed fast cycles, our fed fast cycles also tune our circadian rhythms. Right now, we are trying to ask by doing what is called reverse phase feeding in mice, we are allowing the mouse to actually eat at a period when they're not supposed to eat and ask whether these anticipatory mechanisms are evolutionary encoded by feed in fast, that is availability of food or not, or by sleep wake cycles. We think it's our hypothesis is that it's actually a synergy or synchrony between mechanisms that control our sleep wake cycles and mechanisms that control our fed fast cycles. Together, they orchestrate this gene expression profile.
Okay. Um, on a related note, another question is, so if we are giving this fed-fast cycle to the mice, and say we are feeding it glucose, and say we have one set of mice which have fed and fast cycle made of glucose-rich diet, and another set of mice which have fed and fast uh, cycle which is made on keto-rich diet. Whether SIRT1 expression and its regulation, do they show any difference, and or do they remain the same?
We have not done that, but this is an excellent question. Um, People have not looked at fed fast cycles in dietary regimes. People have usually looked at endpoint assays. People have given high fat diet, high glucose diet, keto diet, paleo diet, and you can name all of those, and looked at what happens at the end state. But it's not just the end state, like you said, and like the person who's probably asking the question, it's all about how you're going to oscillate. What we are trying to propose a hypothesis, and probably if there are physicists and mathematicians in the audience, I would like to call this as a butterfly effect. I think physicists and mathematicians will relate to this. Small changes, you won't be able to quantitatively assess them in our life during our in a daily cycles. Possibly cumulatively give me a phenotype much later. What we see is usually the phenotype at the end, but what causes it seems to be these very small variations which accumulate over a period of time. We don't know what these changes are. Because we are generating a lot of data, we'd like to ask if there is a butterfly effect about small changes contributing to big phenotypic changes. What you score at the end may not be necessarily causal. You need to go back in time.
All right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's what I was trying to say is that all of our bodies, all organisms go through some or the other cycles. Even a bacteria goes through cycles. It could be fed fast cycles, it could be all kinds of cycles. In the context of humans, these are endocrine cycles, these are your sleep wake cycles, these are your everything from reproductive cycles to many things seems to be oscillating. What we are now proposing is that if you are unable to reset this state, because if you go from one state to the other, you need to be able to reset it. If you don't reset, in the next cycle, you go through an altered state. Now, early days, when we are young or when we are healthy young adults, we may not be able to assess these because there is enough buffer capacity in our tissues and our molecular mechanisms. But eventually, this could cumulatively cause a bigger problem as we age, because these could act as a compounding effect and lead to aging and diseases. Now, that's where we are headed. The other thing that becomes relevant is that one is, of course, about understanding about obesity, diabetes, and all of this. Can we also make this kind of science applicable to many other aspects of societal benefits and apply it into contexts which will enable us to explore new frontiers or solve some of the worst problems that we are facing, particularly in the Indian context? So, one of the things that we are trying to do is ask whether genes that we have worked on or mechanisms that we have identified, if activating those or inhibiting those will have any impact on space travel. Because space travel is known to impact almost all of the aspects that I've spoken about, all the way from your muscles, cardiovascular systems, your liver, muscles, everything. You're also in a microgravity environment. You also have perturbed circadian rhythm. You're also exposed to radiation and DNA damaging agents. If you have altered diets, if you have bad diets, if you have altered fat fast cycles, is it likely that it's having a much worse effect? Or is it possible to actually use diets and better interventions to mitigate or reduce the burden of space travel, especially after space travel when the being comes back to the a ground state? What are the impacts of the space travel on aging or lifespan or health? This is something that we are one of the aspects that we want to extend our studies into. So towards this, we are in collaboration with ISRO, where we are trying to ask the role of diet and 31 in guarding the genome and also in maintaining physiological fitness following space travel. So we are sending fruit flies with altered diets or with altered genetic makeups in Gaganyaan 1, which is a crew module that's going to go up. And we want to assess what happens to these fruit flies after they return to Earth, whether there are long-lasting changes or whether we can actually reverse some of the ill effects of space travel once they return to Earth. The other important aspect is this is about exploring new frontiers. But on ground, we have many more urgent needs or burning problems that our societies face. One of this is malnutrition. India seems to be much worse in terms of having not just overweight children, but also children who have muscle wasting, who have stunted growth. And we are probably much worse than sub-Saharan Africa or many other low and middle income countries. One of the issues seems to be because of malnutrition of both carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And actually, not just the malnutrition, is the kind of proteins and fats that we are consuming. Turns out that we are heavily carbohydrate rich and low on these. But even interventions that are being brought about by this, possibly is it possible for us to actually have a much better impact, because these deficiencies are also co-occurring with deficiencies in our vitamins and minerals. Eventually, understanding the interplay between macronutrients and micronutrients will be the key in asking a fundamental question in biology that I spoke to you about all the while. It's all about taking the energy that is available in your diet and either using that to build your body mass or burning it to generate energy. You do more of this, you create problems. You do more of this, also you create problems. Even in growth, would you want to invest in muscles or would you want to invest in adipocytes? Again, a very important decision that has to be made by all of our bodies. We still are far from understanding what are the exact mechanisms that play this. We've gone a lot, we know a lot of information, but we still lack a lot of basic information. So in this context, we are trying to put together a program to understand macro and macronutrient interplay, diet interplay, in determining how much of energy should be burned and how much of energy should be uh, used for growth. With that, I'll stop. And none of this would have been possible without a wonderful team of colleagues, uh, which are my students and my postdocs. Most of the work that I described today were done by Baba Krishna, Tandrika, and Mansi. I didn't have a chance to talk about many others' works. And all of this wouldn't have been possible without funding and a lot of facility help. Um, Hoping that basic research has a societal impact takes ages. Sometimes it's not possible in one's lifetime, but the idea is to generate information which can be used by following work to find a solution to the problem. With that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Ullas. So we have some questions in order. I'll ask them. The first question is, what controls the clutch ANT2 during the
Okay,
feed process?
that's an interesting question. What most people may know or may not know but not appreciate is fat seems to burn more fat. What is activating this clutch is actually the fatty acid itself. Turns out that you can take the engine, which is the mitochondria. There's no body, there's no computer, there's no brain, nothing. You simply continue to feed them with more and more fatty acids. To some extent, you will start making more and more energy. It will plateau, but after a while, it actually starts making less energy. The reason is that this particular clutch seems to be engaged because the fatty acids present in the mitochondria seems to bind to this particular protein called ANT2 and act as a clutch, which means the mitochondria knows that if you're burning a lot of energy-rich nutrition or nutrient, which is the fatty acid, there's no need to make a lot of energy. I can simply burn it as heat, and therefore it engages the clutch. You don't need to make any more ATP. You just burn it as heat. So it seems to be that it's the fatty acid is acting as the clutch. So fats without the carbohydrates or reduced carbohydrates seems to be much better, and carbohydrates are the biggest culprit.
Okay. Another question that came up is, what happens when the body is recovering from starvation?
Good question. Starvation can last from a couple of hours, which happens during our fasting or starvation uh, can last for a couple of hours to overnight, couple of days, weeks, and even longer. We go through a programmed change in our gene expression. In fact, we don't know what is the program and where is the code for that programming lies. We seem to go through a very reproducible change in the kind of pattern of gene expression that we go from A to B to C to D. But then when we refeed, we come back to the refed state, which is all the same. Again, a lot of clinical data indicates that if your refed is bad, if you take the wrong kind of nutrition after a prolonged starvation, you can actually do a lot more harm because your molecular mechanisms are probably not tuned to consume and utilize the nutrition that you're eating. Therefore, there's a lot of work to be done in understanding what is the molecular state of the liver or the body at different states of starvation, and how the nutrition that you bring in after you refeed seems to engage with these molecular mechanisms. Because if you have an overlap, you seem to strike a chord, and therefore you have better effects. If they're desynchronized, actually you might be doing a lot more harm. So good question. As far as I know, I could be wrong, I could be missing some literature here, but as far as I know, we know that it is bad, but what molecular mechanisms are involved, I think it's still we need to go more. Yeah.
All right. Um, the other question is, wouldn't oscillating between feeding and starvation cycles have an effect on the metabolism in terms of how much nutrients is being absorbed and how they're processed?
Yes. So that's what I said. So it's all about frequency. If you're eating low calories and high frequency, it'll have a completely different impact than if you're eating at a low frequency. High frequency and low frequency also seems to be important. Coupled to that is your availability of calories itself. Your feeding and fasting is evolutionary encoded, which means during our evolution, our genes have the memory of knowing when to turn on and when to turn off. In fact, it's the feed fast cycles that have probably encoded this information of when to anticipate when to turn on or when to turn off. Not surprisingly, therefore, feed and fast itself is the biggest determinant. The moment you smell food, you see food, a lot of sensory perception based cues already start activating your metabolic machineries inside your cells. The moment you put your food in your mouth, also a lot of molecular mechanisms are triggered which anticipate. The moment food reaches your gut, there are gut peptides that are released which activate your liver, your pancreas. Also, there is a gut-brain axis. Even before the food reaches your bloodstream, just the mere presence of the food in the gut seems to trigger a lot of responses. We have come to realize or understand or know of these mechanisms only recently. How is it all intertwined? What are the mechanisms? What is the hierarchy of decision making? We know some, but we still need to know a lot more about how the decisions are made and how feed fast cycles are intertwined with the metabolic inputs. If I change the kind of diet, will it all change? Good question.
One more question. The question is, how does dietary restriction extend lifespan?
Okay. I'll give a molecular answer and I'll also give you a more evolutionary answer. Dietary restriction extends lifespan because in the wild, when you have reduced availability of food, normally you want to live longer, you want to suppress your reproduction because one is making offsprings or babies is expensive resource wise. When you make babies or offspring, they become competitors for you. Anyways, there is reduced availability of nutrition. Also, the chances of those offspring surviving is reduced. As a species, you risk dying because you're unnecessarily expending energies on making the babies and feeding them. So your reproduction is suppressed, you live longer. When you're calorie restricted, individuals become more important. In the hope that when you get nutrition in excess, which is the feast cycles, you reproduce a lot, you as an individual become dispensable because you have made your babies, your offsprings are born, you're actually not required. This is a trick that evolution plays. It's the cost of the individual versus the cost of the species. The cost of the individual always becomes more only when your calories are restricted because you want to survive for a longer period. Because your survival determines your species survival. If you're able to reproduce, which happens when you are in excess food, you actually are dispensable. In fact, most of physiologies go bad post reproductive ages. Probably humans are the only one of the few species that survive long after we stop our reproduction, and therefore, not surprisingly, we have a lot of diseases. At a molecular level, it activates many important mechanisms, including sirtuins. Sirtuin seems to be one of the most important sensors of this dietary restriction. We also have energy sensors called AMPK. People in the field will probably appreciate it. In fact, many of the anti-diabetic drugs seems to target this molecule called AMPK. So it's by targeting or regulating these molecules that sense low calories. They can literally sense low calories. The moment you activate these, they trigger all the beneficial effects. Sirtuins, for example, can regulate DNA damage response, can regulate repair, can regulate your telomeres, can regulate pretty much many things you can think about in a cell. At a molecular level, we know a lot about how they do. Therefore, diet seems to be activating these molecules.
Okay. Um, I think this is the last question. The question is, so we spoke about how different diets regulate, how calories basically regulate epigenetic marks on DNA, whether having a glucose-rich diet compared to a keto-rich diet, whether the epigenetic marks that these two different type of diet leave on the DNA is the same, or does it vary according to the diet?
Seems to be varied. Your glucose-rich diet causes a lot of acetylation. I don't know about the methylation pattern because I don't think this particular study looked at methylation, but definitely acetylation of histones increase. Your ketone rich diet seems to have a lot of butyrylation, which is another modification that happens in the histones, seems to be higher. The ketone bodies that are produced by the liver seems to have a major impact on gene expression across the tissues because you produce really high concentrations of ketone bodies during starvation, which seems to be beneficial. There are even studies to indicate that, for example, ketone bodies produced by the microbes that you harbor in your gut, which again are more when you are eating more complex carbohydrate diet or fiber-rich diet, can even protect against mutation-induced cancers in the gut, which means these ketone bodies can also have beneficial effects in mitigating risk of cancers. So ketone bodies or the modifications that are coming from ketone bodies and from the glucose are completely having different impacts on gene expression profiles.
Thank you, Ullas. So I think there are no more questions. I think we'll bring the meeting to an end. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and for giving us a very thought-provoking lecture. Thank you to all the participants who came up with some really good questions and all people who turned up. Thank you
Okay,
all. Have a great weekend.
bye.
Bye.